The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Turek is Wrong about the burden of proof and more. Hey everybody, welcome to the Atheist Debates project video series. I have to say that I mentioned Frank Turek, and I have to point out ahead of time that I don't know that I've ever spoken to Frank. It's possible there's been a quick email exchange or online exchange. I don't believe I've ever debated him. I think there was talk about possibly debating him and it didn't happen, and I don't recall the reasons for it. It's possible that I refused or canceled, or he refused or canceled, or the timing just didn't work out with COVID. Who knows? I know there's been discussions about it. It's just that there's lots of discussions about all these things, and I have no idea. I don't maintain like a mental database of debates that didn't happen. But I will say that I've seen his tweets, and I saw a tweet from him the other day, and I'm going to say from him, I'm going to refer to this as Turek through the whole way because it's his account. It's possible that he has someone else from his ministry typing up these tweets, in which case he's still responsible for how absolutely bonkers wrong they are on his behalf, but we're going to assume that it's him. So this is the tweet that's up here. It says, atheists must make a positive case that only material things exist. That's why instead of debating, does God exist, I prefer to debate the question, what better explains reality, atheism or theism? So let's go through this. First of all, this is a typical dishonest attempt to reframe the burden of proof. And I've spent a lot of time talking about the burden of proof over the years. And so some of the information in here is definitely going to be repeated. But because this keeps coming up, I wanted to kind of go over this in detail about why it's wrong and what's actually happening here with the words, so that when you see tweets like this, you'll be able to spot them quicker and perhaps give a better response, which I'll include towards the end of the video. But it's more wrong even than most people would suspect, because most people at first blush would go through it and be like, well, no, we don't have to prove materialism. And that's true. But there's a lot more going on here. So when he says atheists must, wrong. There's nothing that atheists must do. But in, being as charitable as we can in the reading, what he's suggesting is that in order for atheists to convince people that the atheist position is justified, here's what they need to do. They need to demonstrate that only material things exist. But that's wrong, because atheism is not a position on material things or natural things, or whether or not material natural things are the only things that exist. And it's not a position on whether anything supernatural exists. It's true that most modern atheists that are going to be outspoken, that are atheists because they are skeptics, most of them are not going to be believers in supernatural things. But someone could be an atheist and still think there's a supernatural aspect to reality, or that something exists within the supernatural realm, or that there is a supernatural realm. I don't believe any of that. I don't believe it's warranted. I think every attempt I've ever seen to justify supernatural claims is stopped dead in its tracks by how would you ever identify that something is in fact supernatural. People claim supernatural all the time, and I've got a video up here on the channel. You can dig forward a little bit about how it would be impossible to prove that something supernatural exists. So atheism isn't predicated on philosophical naturalism, which means that atheists don't have to demonstrate that philosophical naturalism is true. And by the way, I don't adhere to philosophical naturalism. I adhere personally to methodological naturalism, which I'll explain the difference in a moment. It's possible, though, that the set of supernatural things, which I think is most likely empty, is not empty, and yet does not also contain a God or a creator. Atheism need only be supported as the default sort of null hypothesis type of position as long as theism consistently fails to meet its burden of proof. So is the natural world all there is? Well, we don't know. It's all that we have access to. It's all that we can observe. It's all that we can interact with. There's nothing beyond nature that we have ever detected or found a way to detect, or have any mechanism that could likely detect. How would you know? And this is why a lot of people will ask the question, well, all these things that people claim are supernatural, if we find out their causes and they're natural, does that mean that they're now a part of the natural world? No, it means they were always a part of the natural world. You just didn't understand enough about the natural world. Well, what if we find something that, people have been describing as supernatural, and we never, ever, ever show that it has a natural cause, isn't it then reasonable to believe it has a supernatural cause? No. That's fallacious thinking, that because you haven't been shown a natural cause, therefore it's reasonable to believe that there's a supernatural cause. That's absolutely fallacious. Now, when I mention null hypothesis, I understand that null hypothesis is traditionally and typically used in a statistical sample model to figure out, hey, we're going to say that these two things, that there's no connection between the two of them. And of course, that is not provable. That's a key aspect of the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis cannot be proven. It's there to be disproven by the alternate hypothesis. And so it's fair to say the null hypothesis is that God has no connection to reality until such time as there's an alternate hypothesis that is demonstrated to show that a God has a connection to reality, which is basically God doesn't exist until somebody can demonstrate that God exists. And there's really, really, really good reasons for that. Not the least of which is that you would be put in a position to believe in multiple different gods because you can't disprove them. So that's why I tend to use the default position and null hypothesis to talk about these things. It's because the general public has a good enough understanding of these sort of what can you prove, what can't you prove, and why should the burden of proof be where it is, which is why I say that atheism is the position of finding God not guilty of existing. That doesn't mean we've concluded he's innocent of existing. He may exist, but given the information that's been presented to us, we are forced to maintain the default position, the innocent until proven guilty, that God is not guilty of existing. When you look into how some of these things are phrased, you'll see that Frank says, that's where instead of debating, does God exist? Okay, cool. I can appreciate not wanting to debate that topic again. I prefer to debate the question, what better explains reality, atheism or theism? And he says, this is why he prefers to do this, which I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm not too keen on saying people are lying, because I think it has a burden of proof that you have to meet. But in this case, I think there's some self-deception going on if he actually believes that, if he thinks the reason he prefers to debate atheism versus theism as an explanation instead of does God exist is because atheists must make a positive claim for materialism. Well, he's wrong. He misunderstands the burden of proof. He misunderstands atheism, and that's not why he prefers to. The real reason he prefers to debate which is the better explanation for reality, atheism or theism, is because it's a big red herring that helps him avoid the fact that he has no defense for what he actually believes. He doesn't have a deductive argument supported by evidence. He doesn't have an inductive argument supported by evidence. So he's going to try to make an abductive argument, which only needs to be used when there's not a good, strong deductive or inductive argument to be made. His thinking, even though it may not be explicitly presented, where he's consciously aware of it this way, is that since he can't prove that a God exists, he can just provide, and he can't provide deductive or inductive arguments for it. He'll just go with an abductive one. Like, what's the best explanation? Because his phrasing is completely wrong. What's the better explanation for reality, atheism or theism? Well, atheism and theism, those are beliefs about a God, and beliefs don't explain reality. These aren't the mechanisms that could explain reality. Your belief is never going to be an explanation for reality unless you are positing that you are the creator who is creating a reality because of your belief. This is a sort of the secret thing of getting what you wish for or think for. But I get it. This is a tweet. I'm not going to beat him up for saying atheism or theism. Maybe he's running out of characters. But what he's really asking here is, what's the better explanation, the natural world or magic? But if he types that, it's a little too on the nose. It's a little too obvious where the problem rests. So we tend to explain things in terms of other things that are understood. We work to solve mysteries by appealing to the things that aren't mysterious. It doesn't do any good to try to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery. Magic isn't understood and isn't demonstrably real. In fact, to quote my late friend James Randi, real magic is fake and fake magic is real. We look at that and we kind of understand what it means and we get a chuckle out of it. But there's a deeper layer here, which is he's making an appeal to, if you can't prove that only material things exist, I get to leverage in everything then. So if we're asking the question, here we have a universe. Did it come around by natural causes, including some causes that we don't understand? Or was it the intentional product of a thinking agent outside of time and reality? Two concepts for which we have no evidence. There's no reason to think that outside of reality or outside of time are any more cogent points than before time. Then you go and create, the theists go and create a panacea, but a panacea is supposed to serve as an answer for anything. God can do anything, be anything, God can manifest anything, God can interact with reality. Therefore, there's no question that we couldn't answer with, God did it. It's a panacea, but it's an unfalsifiable proposition. How do you prove that there isn't a magical being outside of space and time who created reality? That's what they're really defending here. They're saying if you can't prove that only the natural world exists, then that opens the door to everything, which is why they spend so much time trying to force others to disprove what can't be disproved. They have an unfalsifiable proposition. There's no possible way to prove there's no God anywhere ever without having exhaustive knowledge of everything, including, if there's something beyond space and time, having exhaustive knowledge of all that is beyond that, which we might have exhaustive knowledge of everything that's beyond space and time because there may be nothing beyond space and time. If we were trying to prove the germ theory of disease to people who didn't believe it, scientists would never be running around saying, well, you need to prove that there aren't germs causing disease. When you see tweets like this, attempting to disguise this confused and dishonest burden of proof shifting, call them out. I like what J.T. Eberhard came up with and used in several debates, which was prove you're not a murderer. Just, hey, if you're going to say that atheists have to prove that philosophical materialism is true, well, maybe you should have to prove you're not a murderer. Oh, I shouldn't have to prove that. But we have dead bodies that you can't prove you didn't kill. So it makes sense that maybe you did. The default assumption is that no gods exist. Because if we default to some God exists until proven, we have to apply that to all proposed gods, and you would be stuck accepting multiple mutually exclusive God concepts. You'd have to, in order to remain intellectually honest. Otherwise, you're engaged in special pleading. So if someone's particular belief in Jesus or Krishna or whatever is predicated on the notion that atheists haven't proven philosophical materialism, and yet they don't believe in all those other gods that atheists haven't disproved, well, then they're engaged in special pleading. But they don't want that to come to light. If you try to push back on tweets like this by saying, hey, have you disproved these other religions? Here's what you'll get. And it's one of the most obnoxiously evasive responses ever. What you'll get is, well, we could get into that. I wanted to talk about materialism versus supernaturalism first. That's what this post was about. It was about naturalism versus supernaturalism, and not about which God. Are you conceding, in fact, that there is a supernatural realm and that there could be a God? Because that's something we can discuss after I get you to concede that you can't prove that only the material exists. See, I'm going to give you a new unfalsifiable proposition, and when you admit that you can't falsify it, and I get you to concede that, I can pretend that you've instead conceded that something other than the material world could exist, possibly exists, probably exists, does exist, and then we follow that slippery slope right down into other supernatural things, and then gods, and then work towards a specific God. This is the trick that apologists are doing. Nobody has to do this for anything that is at all demonstrable. If you ask, how and why do you believe this? And somebody says, well, you can't prove that it's wrong. You get to dismiss that entirely right off the bat. And for the people who are asserting, as they did in responses to this, that I'm claiming that there is no God, and I'm doing so as an assertion without proof, as I've reminded many of them, no, I'm stating I'm not convinced that there's a God, and that the null hypothesis and default position should be that no one should believe there is a God until such time as the case has actually been made. So when you see tweets like this, don't give them 1 inch toward their goal. I mean, you might be able to play along in a, kind of a for the sake of argument type of discussion briefly. But if you give them the initial ground of pretending that this statement, that atheists must demonstrate materialism first, is actually a reasonable response to anything or a reasonable defense to their theism, you have already messed up. So I'm sorry, Dr. Turek, but we're not going to let you try to fool people into being foolish.